All right, I think welcome everyone to the SIG Network Policy API meeting on the 21st of May, 2024. Let's all follow the Kubernetes Code of Conduct and be nice to each other. We have a few items on the agenda today, so we can get started, though it does seem like a small quorum. Nadia, do you want to kick us off?
Yep, thank you. I wanted to just get some opinions, and then having not too many people today, maybe we will do that
Can you
offline also.
hear me? I can't hear Nadia. Is it me?
Oh,
I can hear her.
am I speaking to someone or not?
I can hear you. I don't.
I can hear you now.
Okay,
Yes.
cool. All right, so yeah, I'll try to begin again. So yeah, I just wanted to gather some opinions on a potential feature that I think was asked for a couple times, and I have a idea of how that could potentially be done. So that's about it, like dry run mode. Maybe that's audit mode, or that feature potentially has multiple names. That's for people who want to make sure some connections will not be broken or denied after they apply network policy. So what they want to do is run it first in like some dry run mode. And it's usually, I think, combined with some kind of logging. So basically, the idea is you enable that in dry run mode. Basically, what happens is all deny rules are switching to allow rules. That means that the ACL evaluation or whatever happens stops right there. But instead of denying anything, it will be allowed, and as some kind of log will be emitted. So we don't have, I think we figured that we cannot really have any specific logging API upstream because of all the different log formats and possibilities in different implementations. But I'm thinking if we could enable this kind of dry run mode, just to say that that's a way for users to basically do this part, and then how these potentially unexpected allow rules will be hit, how that's going to be logged, or how this information is going to be provided back to the user will be implementation specific. Right, so I don't want to just maybe dig too deep into the details of how that should be organized for now. I just wanted to hear some feedback if that's something many implementations have, if that's a popular ask, or if maybe you think it's impossible to do.
I'm curious. How would this? How would you propose this as an API?
Yeah. No, I see. Well, there is some way to the API, but I guess it could be just some field in the BNP itself. And yeah, I mean, that's, and but maybe we should actually, for the API, I hope to hear back from some implementations that have some similar options, because it's potentially like having an extra field saying dry run true or something like that may be easier to update to the actually implemented option than changing an action in the network policy itself, for example.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey Nadia. So actually this feature is kind of already on the policy assistant roadmap. So do you basically what we were thinking of doing, let me know if this is kind of the same idea. We're thinking of getting all the connections in the cluster and all the policies and producing some output of all the allowed connections and denied connections, and which policies are causing those to happen.
Right. I think the only difference is that, if I understand correctly, the assistant is an offline kind of tool. So you basically get the information in YAMLs or whatever from the cluster, and then you kind of predict what's about to happen. And what I'm saying is it's happening in the real data path.
So would this be more like implementations log what they actually do as opposed to like what is the, like policy assistant would more so be like the ideal behavior if you're following the spec perfectly.
Right. So you're
different.
Right. So you're saying that using assistant should be like reliable enough to not even need this feature?
I think like the policy assistant, we're already building like, or built like basically an implementation of network policy and admin network policy, and then I guess we're kind of doing what other implementations would have to do. I guess my thinking is like if we're already putting all this effort into the simulation engine, like the implementation and policy assistant, could we trust it for this use case as well?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think if you could provide the link for the specific issue for that, maybe explaining how exactly it's gonna work, because I thought that I'm not an expert in this assistant, so I'm not sure if it will be able to predict like all the possible connections that now will, I mean, how simple it will be to analyze the output, right? I mean, comparing that to the real pod sending some real traffic. So you're like, oh, I thought that this packet actually will match the rule, but apparently it doesn't. And here is the log that says me that. While some like more static information, I think you need some extra human brain power to make sure you're like interpreting that correctly. But yeah, I think we need to figure out more what will be the possibilities of the policy assistant here.
Okay, yeah, I'll send that link over. I'll send the link over. Just driving right now. I think we already like have this idea in place, and then we can refine like how we want to display it. Because I haven't, finalized any thoughts about like how we should log it, and that would be like really good to get opinions on.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Sorry, I was worried that Rahul has his hand raised. Yeah.
Oh, okay, my bad.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to clarify about the policy assistant. How does it know what connections are actually happening? Like, are we installing this as a sidecar on the data path? Or are you supposed to write down like a custom YAML file of all the connections that you think are going to happen?
Yeah, so my initial thought was we could potentially brute force all the possible connections, getting all the pods in the cluster and like sending fake traffic between all of them. But then another thought, if we want to be implementation agnostic, we want to use the exact connections happening in the data path. We could use maybe some network observability tool like Cilium Subble to get the flow logs. Are there other CNI agnostic BPF programs to do that?
I mean, I'm concerned about relying on that for assistant, right? Like data paths can do all sorts of interesting things, and it'd be really tricky to get compliance with even 2 or 3 of them, let alone, if someone decides to do something custom, which is where I think this proposal has a lot more power, because it's really telling implementations, hey, this is your job to figure out, right? The customer's asking, I want to make these policies and know what happens. And then it becomes every implementation's responsibility to do it correctly. Whereas if we do it in the assistant, the burden falls on the open source community to work with every single implementation. That's my interpretation. Maybe I'm not seeing that correctly.
Yeah, I hear that. I guess my counterpoint to that would be, like, shouldn't we have conformance tests in place so that implementations are guaranteed to follow the spec? And then it's additionally kind of like, if we're building this policy assistant tool but telling users to use like the implementations, dry run modes, then what's our story about the user tooling we're providing?
That's a fair point. I guess
Becomes my question.
if I understood Nadia's user story correctly, and this is something I've seen from customers as well, it's that they want to add new network policies, right? But they need some confirmation that what they're doing is correct. They don't want to blow up a production cluster. And so their go-to is always install the policy and put it in a dry run mode with logging enabled, so that the only thing that it does is just say, I would have allowed this traffic, I would have denied this traffic. I think that's what the user wants. If we can do that easily from the assistant, that's probably a great place to put it. The concern is just how do we actually capture real cluster traffic, right, in a implementation agnostic way? That sounds hard to me, but
Yeah,
we should definitely brainstorm that.
Yeah, capturing the connections is actually something I know Cilium Subble can do, as well as there's a Retina open source project that also gets the connections on Linux workloads.
But then you need a real cluster and like basically capturing data from that real cluster and providing that to the assistant, which is slightly more complicated, but yeah.
And
I
if you
also
use
think there are,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
now I was about to say there's also security implications. I don't think we really want to feed something from the cluster to, especially for customers, and then feed that into an engine and get something and feed it back. So we might, yeah, sorry, I cut over somebody.
Is it a good time for me to chime in a little bit?
Yes, yeah, go for it.
Oh, sorry. I was also driving, so I couldn't see anybody raising hands. I was trying to say this in the Antrea perspective, but mostly I think from my own perspective, because I got a little bit thrown off in terms of what you say by I want to see a dry run and get some status in the data path. That's kind of like a little bit surprising to me, and I'll tell you why. Because in my opinion, I do see that customers would want to do a dry run and understand what the policy would do to the cluster. But in my opinion, the only reason why customers may want to do that is they don't want it to interrupt traffic, right? So if they don't want it to deny something that they shouldn't have denied, which break things or accidentally allow stuff. So in the perspective of Antrea, or let's say if we have this sort of like a requirement and we were to implement in the CNI in Antrea, I would think something a little bit different in terms of putting this related to data paths at all. Because I do think in most implementations, we do have two parts, right? One, we would call something in the lines of a controller, and the other, we call it in a sense of agent, where we actually install data path rules. I'm believing most implementations doesn't have this. So what I was thinking that we could have something where, we look at the current policy in the cluster or the current connection in the cluster. The controller should have known, what should happen to all these connections, right? And after, let's say, a dry run, we have new policy in the cluster. The controller should, I think, be able to compute what's going to happen, what's going to change, and then essentially the information is there, right? So there are a couple of new rules that we wanted to install in the data path, and then we should have an idea of what new connections will be allowed or denied because the policy is applied. So in my opinion, we have those informations. We can probably derive something to tell the customer already that, hey, if you apply this policy, we think this would happen. We think these connection statuses would change, but I don't really feel like we would need to install anything actually on the data path just to prove that, because if the interpretation of the controller and the actual data path after applying those rules is different, then we actually just found a bug in CNI, which that's a different story, right? But I'm not really convinced that for a feature like this, we needed to actually touch anything in terms of data path. That's sort of my 2 cents on this, I guess.
Maybe one point to clarify that, at least this is how I'm thinking about it. I don't see this as a conformance decision so much as a live analysis tool. So like if we have a reliable way of getting actual connections from the cluster, right? And streaming those to either the assistant or the controller in this case, then yeah, I guess we don't need to change the data path. My only thinking is we want to put this in the data path because getting a reliable stream of connections is really hard. If you've got a big cluster with thousands and thousands of connections per node, you'll quickly overwhelm your operator by streaming a ton of connections to it, right? Whereas the data path is by design distributed and is more, in my mind, is more well situated to perform this dry run.
Nadia?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a very
I think, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think I hear your concern being, if we wanted to simulate a bunch of connections, for a big cluster, there can be tons of pods already, let alone that if we wanted to, for example, simulate connections like TCP or UDP on different ports, that's basically gonna be impossible. And also, I think getting the current established connections in a live cluster will also be kind of tough. What I think I was thinking was more in lines of, we wanted to do a dry run. We wanted to apply a new policy, and then, the customer or the user should supply maybe specific probes they wanted to validate. For example, I wanted to validate, a couple of policies, and then after these policies are applied, I specifically wanted to know that for a single namespace to another namespace on port 80, would that change after the policy is applied? I think that's more reasonable for us to implement rather than, something like after applying a policy, what exact effect would it change to the cluster? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think I wanted to clarify, maybe you got confused by me saying that we want some information from the data path. What I actually meant is from the running implementation, whatever it is. So I never thought actually that we need to force that to the data path in any way. Basically, and that's why we just have an API, right? And what we need to define is how this dry run mode will change the effect of the applied admin network policy, which I think, and again, there are some tricky parts about, I think the allow rules or skip rules maybe can stay as they are, but then deny rules may need to be switched to allow to actually stop further evaluation. So that's just all we need to do, right? Just define how exactly the dry run mode ad network policy will affect the current traffic, and then see how the implementation of the network plugin can provide back information on which connections are affected by this network policy in the dry run. And then different plugins may use different ways to do that. Someone may implement something really in the data path and then add some logs. Someone I think Yangi said you can provide this information from the controller itself somehow. So these options of how to provide that kind of feedback may be different and implementation specific, I think.
Nathan?
Yeah, I want to speak against this proposal. I don't think it belongs in the network API. I think this is a CNI implementation idea. I think it's a good idea, but I can speak for Cilium that if we tried to implement an API where you specifically added some kind of dry run flag to an ANP, the way we've implemented connection tracking and policy enforcement, I actually think that this would be an NP hard problem to solve. I don't think it's actually a soluble problem in some implementations, especially in clusters that are large, which is where I suspect you would think it would be most useful. And then the other thing I would like to say against this is that if you're using a dry run mechanism to ensure that a policy that you're about to add to your cluster isn't going to break something, you're managing your network policies incorrectly. That is like a really bad way to make a decision. You're not guaranteed that you're even correct, especially in a large cluster where the connections are often dynamic and you don't even know if the existing connections that are there are representative of what will exist. So I just think that making policy decisions off of active connections is not a good way to manage a cluster. And if a customer came to us and asked for this feature, I think we would feel comfortable telling them like you shouldn't manage policies this way.
Yeah, well, that's a controversial topic, I think. We tell customers what's the best way to do something, yet they still manage to do it, usually the other way around, which is, still a valid point. But yeah, I don't know. I think I've heard so many requests on that it made me think that it is actually a useful feature potentially.
I guess it brings me back to the first point I made though, which is this a network policy API problem, or does this exist lower down? Like, to me, I do think that this exists in the policy assistant, and I question whether this belongs in this SIG.
Right, that's actually a part of this question, right? To get this kind of feedback, because I think some implementations have something like that, right? And the point is, if we know there are enough requests to do something, we could bring it upstream. It's better to do that because then it's like shared by everyone, and yeah, can be used from the upstream API. The question I have though is I thought of I hope there is a potential for most implementations to support that, but I'm not sure about that. If all of the implementations support some kind of logging at all.
I think a dry run mode where you can see policy verdicts is very doable and is actually something that a lot of implementations already have. But having a specific policy or that's the only thing that affects the running, doesn't affect the running cluster, I have a feeling that most implementations would struggle to figure that out.
Yeah, maybe you can provide some details into why you think that will happen, later.
Sure.
I'm not sure I got that part, because I have my own idea of how that could be implemented, probably. So yeah, it would be interesting to hear. Maybe you can just leave a comment or some more points in the agenda, or if it ever makes to become an issue or a proposal, then we'll definitely move it there too.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, and that's exactly the feedback I was looking for, right? Because that's one of the options. Does it even belong to the API? Does it bring real value? How simple it is to implement? Are there some obvious limitations for some implementations potentially that we are bringing with it? So yeah, thank you all for the discussion.
Okay, sounds good. I think we got a lot of different perspectives on this idea. Thank you, Nadia, for bringing it up. Anything more on that point before we move to the next item?
I guess just one extra question of the main point I tried to figure out if that's idea worth continuing working on at all or not. So I could just leave it here in the agenda and then see if it ever comes up again, or I could try to convert that into an issue or like potential NPAP and continue the discussion there. So what are your thoughts on that? Or maybe I should bring it up next time when we have more people. I don't know.
I think there was already an issue for dry run created by Hunter, right? And I know that that was in the policy assistant side, but we don't want to do two different things for sure, or maybe we do, but whatever, we could use that issue to capture it, or I don't know, clone it. But definitely, I think we warrant an issue so that we capture everything we discussed today. And maybe we can also wait for Sean or Calico to pitch in, because we got some good feedback from Cilium and Andrea. So, but yeah, +1 to capturing it in an issue and then seeing if there is potential for an NPEP.
Okay, well, sounds good.
I want to be clear that I do like the idea of a dry run where you can see maybe cluster wide what's going on, and there's no policy enforcement. I think that's a good idea. But the idea of just doing it for one policy somehow, while all the other policies are still enforced, I'm pretty sure, at least in Cilium, I'm pretty sure we would not be able to implement that. Or at least we would have to maybe do a policy engine rewrite.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, let's see, maybe we don't need to do that per policy. Maybe there are some other modes that will be more helpful. Yeah, I think I'll just create another issue to just not reuse the policy assistant, as I think it may be slightly different, right? And that's a good point to discuss what we can do with the policy assistant. So just to separate the discussions, but I'll just definitely link it there.
Yeah, sounds good. And I think we can link the policy assistant issue from this so that, we have everything.
Oh, I did.
In the right
I think
place.
add the link there from Hunter in the agenda. Yeah.
Oh, here. Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Nadia. I think that looks good. So shall we move on? There's an item from Rahul around FQDN.
Yeah, thanks. I guess this won't actually be final since we're missing a few people, but hopefully we can all agree on a few points, and I'll just call them out so people can review them. I just want to knock out a couple of the major open items here. I don't think there's strong feeling one way or another on these, is what I'm getting. So I'm hoping we can all just agree on one point, and if worse comes to worse, revisit in beta. The first one is about the wildcard semantics. We've gone back and forth on whether it should match a single domain or whether it should expand to multiple subdomains. The current proposal is a single star will match lots of subdomains, right? It can match one or it can match multiple. There was a quick mention that we might want both types of semantics, that you want to either match a single subdomain or use something like a double star to say, actually, we really need the full depth of subdomains. My leaning is to say, stick with what we have right now, which is a single star will match multiple subdomains. But I want to hear if people have opinions or what people are thinking. Nadia, I think, right?
Yeah, just wanted to ask, you said just the current kind of version mentions multiple subdomains match, right? I actually thought the opposite, but basically the point I wanted to make is that we tried to make our NPAPs kind of smaller, right, and more iterative. So I thought actually if we stick to the simplest one, which is one wildcard, just one label match, and then we could like almost immediately open like the next iteration to discuss exactly that. Right, but that will at least help us merge this first version, which like kind of the next improvement will potentially, if we decide to match multiple labels, it will not really break it, right? Which just like kind of extends the semantics of this wildcard. So yeah,
I think the problem is that for most implementations who actually did FQDN now, it's that semantics being one star can potentially match different a couple of subdomains. So it's maybe a little bit easier that way because it's sort of like a little bit established patterns now. At least when I was researching it, so blame Calico for it, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think I agreed myself that makes more sense. I just thought if it will take, I'm just trying to see how we can make this first iteration kind of merged faster, I guess, and then like continue separate discussions in different places. But if that's like actually important for lots of implementations, yeah, sure, let's just continue there.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I kind of just want to make a decision and move on because my suspicion is that there exists an implementation that's done it the opposite way, no matter which way we choose. So someone's going to be unhappy. We just need to pick one and kind of roll with it. I'm going to propose a single star matches multiple subdomains, as that was what Sean was mentioning, I think a few meetings ago. And it didn't seem like anybody thought that was horrible or wildly unimplementable. So I'm just going to stick to that and we can revisit. All right, cool. That sounds good. I think the second one, again, there was a little bit of back and forth. This one's just on the naming. Right now, the top level field, in the egress peer, I think it's called domains right now. Someone made a good point that maybe it should be called domain names. We also considered domain name patterns. It's not clear to me that the RFC is 100% explicit on what we should do, right? But I feel like domain names is a decent compromise. It doesn't sound confusing and it doesn't sound wildly incorrect. Does anyone have any opinions or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I suggested the domain names while there was a nice version of domains to it, just like my brain kept adding names silently in the end. So I thought maybe and I think we did research on the RFC and there is no, yeah, as you said, there is no single answer what's more correct, quote unquote, domains or domain names. So I guess whatever kind of sounds better to the most of us should be the answer, but yeah.
I appreciate that suggestion. I think domain names is good.
All right, any other thoughts, counterpoints? Otherwise, we're gonna roll with domain names for both the name of the field as well as for the type of the struct. Alrighty. And then the final one. This was something that Antonio brought up, and I know we discussed this in the past, and we mentioned maybe punting it to a second iteration. I can mention that to Antonio as well, but basically the concern was around, if you've got a bunch of domains, they can have lots of IPs that back them. This can quickly balloon out of control, and implementations will have trouble keeping track of everything. I proposed an artificial limit. I said, each domain you support up to, let's say, 100 IPs. We can pick whatever number we like, but I'm just throwing some arbitrary line in the sand. Do people feel strongly that we shouldn't discuss a limit right now, or if people have a number that they want to propose, I'm happy to switch that up. Just want to hear thoughts from people.
I think in the past with the existing API, with ingress rules, egress rules, we have put random numbers like 1,000 priority and then 100 ingress per ANP, 100 egress. I think all of this was actually random. I'm
Right.
okay in the alpha stage to settle on a number, whatever that is amongst this group. And then we can iterate it before we move to beta when we do have actual scale testing and data to back it up. And Yang or Nadia has her hand raised.
Yeah, there is a slight difference, unfortunately, with that example, because it's not just the API limitation of how many objects you can create or whatever specify, but that actually may break something if some DNS name returns more than 100 IPs, and that some of them are just not added to the right structures, so that will not really work then. So that may be a bit more dangerous, I would say. But I have a question about the number of IPs. Do you mean also for the wildcard the DNS names?
I mean per actual domain name. So not per rule, but per
Ah.
domain. So if you do star.kubernetes.io, blog.kubernetes and web.kubernetes each get 100.
So should we then add a limit on the number of DNS names that a wildcard entry may be resolved to?
That's also another interesting limit we can explore. I'm not sure which scaling dimension is the best place to put the limit, right? IPs or domain or what it is.
Probably both.
Probably both, yeah.
Yeah, I actually had another suggestion on just to also kind of artificially limit the amount of potential domain names that may be resolved from the wildcarded name, right? Which is to limit the wildcard to at least 2 labels. So to deny a name saying wildcard.com, which may be resolved to all IPs on Earth. So, and then to say, I don't know if that's useful or not, but to say that you should have at least 2 labels. So wildcard kubernetes.io, right? So at least 2 that potentially should limit the scale, but again, you still can blow up, I guess.
Yeah, I'm
But
okay
that
with
was,
saying 2 labels. That seems reasonable to me.
It's
And
also easy to validate in the in the API itself, I think.
right. I actually adopted the regex that you suggested. I think that's totally reasonable. I don't know that anyone really wants to allow star.com or star.org or whatever. That feels very weird.
Yeah, but actually that maybe that could be a nice discussion for the next iteration, that we again could start almost immediately, kind of just move this discussion to the next iteration, because scale, I mean, it will not change the API itself much unless I don't think we'll actually have anything in the API itself limiting that, probably mostly docs or something.
Yeah.
All right, sounds like a long discussion potentially.
So is the proposal to mention nothing right now, or to just write 100 and then revisit?
Yeah, I think I'd write 100 and revisit is a good idea. And also, I wanted to clarify real quick. We did say that we wanted to respect the TTL of the DNS records, right?
Yes.
And to me, if that is true, and for a single domain name, we still get 100 IPs is unfathomable. I mean,
remember they use both IPv4 and IPv6 actually, even in
well,
one
still.
So it's kind of 50 per. But yeah, I mean.
Well,
that's
right,
quite a lot.
That's quite a lot, right? You would assume that for a single cluster, when you make a request to at least some service or FQDN you're talking to, there must be some sort of affinity at least. And considering in most times TTLs are also short, even if you get really distinctive results, and then after a while some of them should already expire. I don't see 100 IP records for a single FQDN to stuck around in a CNI for a period of time. That's just crazy to me. But so to me, I feel like 100 obviously is already a lot. So if by any chance we actually have some FQDN in a given time where it resolves to more than 100 valid IPs that still haven't passed at TTLs, that's going to be a really, really interesting use case I wanted to look at, because I can't even think of something that does that right now.
All right, that sounds good. I think, yeah, let's write down 100 and then we can iterate. Also, it should be safe, because at worst you'll just deny traffic. It's not a security hole. So it should be okay for us to implement this, and then worst case, we can just relax it if customers are having a bad day. All right.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think just to get started, we can go with the number and then iterate there.
Perfect. All right, those were the big ones. Thanks, everyone. I will bug. I think I need Dan, Andrew, Nadia as well. Please take another look. Give me approvals or comments, whatever the case may be.
I definitely will. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Rahul. I hope we get this merged in quick. And that's all in the agenda that we have for today. Anything else anybody wants to bring up? If not, have a great rest of your day. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.